Hi everybody, my name is Matt Sereda and I am the Equity Learning Coordinator for the Thames Valley District School Board. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I am excited to chat with all of you today about what educators can do to chat about healthy relationships and dating issues with students. I'm going to come back in about 2 to 3 minutes and we'll have the conversation then. Okay, so I'll come back in about 2 or 3 minutes and then we'll chat about some issues with students today. See you in a couple minutes. So hi everybody, thanks for joining our chat today on what teachers can do to support students in healthy relationships and dating issues. So again, for those just tuning in, my name is Matt Sereda. I'm the Equity Learning Coordinator for the Thames Valley District School Board. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And I'm really honored and thankful to be able to have this chat with you today about such an important topic for all students in Ontario schools right now. So before I get into our talk on specifically what educators can do, I do want to talk about a couple of issues that I think have been in the media the last little while. Stats Canada released some survey data just last week on instances of hate crime in Canada over the past year. And I think it's really troubling, and I think we need to think about this conversation about healthy relationships in some of those contexts as well. So some of the data from StatsCan last week indicated that, first of all, hate crimes have increased from 2016 to this year by 46% across the country. But the largest province with the increase in hate crimes was Ontario. So first of all, we need to take that into consideration. But then also, when we look at the specific instances of hate crimes, we see that 43% of hate crimes last year were motivated by hate of race or ethnicity, whereas 41% of hate crimes were motivated by a hate of religion and creed, and 10% of all hate crimes were motivated by hate of sexual orientation. And then I think it's also important that we think about today's chat about healthy relationships, consent, dating issues, and all of that. Understanding that today, this chat is happening on the eve of the massacre that occurred at École Polytechnique 29 years ago, when a gunman shot 28 people and killed 14 women. And so I think I share all of this information as a preface on our chat on healthy relationships to remember just what happens in society when hatred, violence, misogyny, racism, sexism is allowed to flourish in communities all around our world. I also share this information as a reminder that adults, especially teachers, we have one of the greatest privileges, I think, in our world, and that's we get to be a caring adult in the life of a child or a student. And I think we have an awesome opportunity to talk about and to model and to share what a world free of discrimination and violence might look like and what might feel like. So I do want to bring all of that into our conversation today, and remember that these conversations are not happening in isolation, that our classrooms and our schools are not neutral spaces, and that students absolutely bring their lived experiences with them into their classroom every day. So with all of that in mind, and thinking about our chat today, when we think about developing healthy relationships with students, when we think about how we can talk to students about navigating tough issues like dating issues, I really wanted to spend some time today talking to other educators, fellow educators like myself, in some of our the ways we can go about these conversations, but some of the other pieces of information that we need to keep in mind when we have these conversations with students. And so I am going to break our conversation down today into 5 subtopics that I think are important for us to be thinking about when we have these conversations with our students in classrooms. The first, I want to spend a little bit of time looking at the Ontario curriculum and understanding that the curriculum needs to guide all aspects of conversations whenever we're working with students in schools or in classrooms. I want to make sure that we spend some time talking about a trauma-informed lens, or sort of taking into consideration some of the students' lived experiences when they enter into our classrooms. I want to also take a look at some of the different cultural nuances that inform this conversation, and make sure that we're respectful of all students regardless of their backgrounds. And then really focus a little bit of time on what educators can do to model healthy relationships first and foremost. And then at the end, I'm going to share some resources of great community organizations as well as websites that I think can help educators when they have these conversations with students in classes. And so I think the first subtopic that I really wanted to spend a little bit of time on this morning was really taking a deeper look at the Ontario education curriculum, specifically the health and physical education curriculum documents, and how they support these conversations in all grades and at all levels whenever we're working with students in classrooms. So I do always like to point out that as educators in the province of Ontario, we do have a legal obligation as per the Education Act to teach the Ontario curriculum. The curriculum does need to be our guide whenever we're having any conversations with students, but we're lucky. We're lucky to live in a province like Ontario that has consent, that has healthy relationships embedded into all levels of learning for students. And so I think it's important to recognize that at the elementary curriculum level, to start, that these conversation points are represented in more general ways. So when we look at grades 1 to 3, we see that students are meant to learn skills related to self-advocacy, recognizing the signs of bullying relationships in grades 4 and 6. But then when we get into the high school levels, that's when the curriculum does become a little more specific and concrete. So we see notions related to consent, notions related to physical and mental wellness really being explored at a much more thorough level in the secondary curriculum. I think it's also important to recognize that the curriculum, all curriculum, specifically the health and physical education curriculum, is designed to act as a set of building blocks with learning expectations in earlier grades, acting as a foundation for different learning opportunities in older grades. And so with this in mind, we see that healthy relationships that are built on a foundation of understanding oneself, empathy, and mutual respect are actually present in all levels of the Ontario curriculum. The way we have those conversations is absolutely different. We need to pay attention to the age and stage of the students that we're working with. And so certain language might not be used until high school, but absolutely the concepts are still very much present in the elementary curriculum. So I know, however, that there is still a lot of confusion and miscommunication about what is covered and what is allowed to be spoken about, specifically in the re-released 2010 Health and Physical Education document that was released to all school boards in the province of Ontario this past August. And so to help with an understanding of this new document that educators need to teach and need to use as a basis of conversations with students, the Thames Valley District School Board has created a reference guide or sort of a snapshot of the different grades that covers the different expectations from grade 1 to 8. And so we will be posting a link to that Thames Valley overview document in the comment section of this chat, so that if anybody wants some specific information related to how this conversation is taken up in the various grades, that document is a great document to start with. But those, I think, like myself, that you always want sort of a deeper insight or deeper knowledge into sort of exactly how the curriculum supports these conversations in all grades and stages for students. I suggest going to the curriculum document itself. And then in relation to sort of healthy relationships, consent, dating issues, all of that, I really encourage educators in Ontario to take a specific look at the healthy living strand for the various grades, because that's where we'll see most of the information related to this topic mentioned. It's also important to note that the health and physical education document for secondary grades did not change this past summer or this past year, and schools in that way are still mandated to teach the health and physical education document that was released in 2015. And so all of the curriculum expectations, discussions, concepts that were able to be talked about last year in secondary school absolutely are still present in the current curriculum that our teachers have access to this year. And so I just always like to bring us back to that notion that it is important that all educators in the province of Ontario use the most current curriculum, as this is the best way to ensure equitable learning environments for all students. And so also paying attention to sort of how the curriculum is written. Sometimes it's written as general expectations, general guidelines for conversations in classes, whereas at the secondary level, we see more concrete, specific examples of how this conversation is to be taken up. I think that brings us to our next subtopic of what I wanted to chat about, which is this notion of a trauma-informed lens. And so we always have to pay very careful attention to the lived experience of the students that we're serving in our spaces, and understanding that any conversation about healthy relationships, dating violence, dating issues, sexual violence, that sort of thing, students might be experiencing some of these behaviors in their personal life. And so being very mindful about how we structure and frame these conversations from a trauma-informed lens, so as not to cause any more harm for students when we have these conversations. So SACHA, Sexual Assault Center here in Ontario, does indicate on their website that 1 in 3 women will experience sexual violence in their lifetime, and 1 in 6 men will experience sexual violence in their lifetime. So we do have to pay, I think, careful attention to the fact that this is a very real issue for a lot of the students that we might be working with. And so we need to treat it with sort of the sensitivity and respect that goes along with that. And so in order to do that, the Thames Valley District School Board, we have created, it was adopted by the Ministry of Education, but we've created what is called an educator and an administrator's decision support tool. And this is really meant to help educators and administrators apply a trauma-informed lens in all classroom activities that might potentially be triggering for students. So whenever we're bringing in content, whenever we're wanting to show a video, watch a film, bring in a guest speaker, the decision support tool for both educators and administrators is meant as a checklist of different things that need to be considered first, so as to make sure that whatever is chatted about in our spaces or in our classrooms doesn't cause any more harm to students. And so we can post a link to this decision support tool in the comment section as well. And so really the decision support tool reinforces the reality that various students come from, and that the first responsibility of all educators is to ensure that students are able to participate in equitable and safe learning opportunities that affirm their individual lived experiences. It is also encouraged that whenever educators are using a trauma-informed lens to support students in conversations related to healthy relationships and dating issues, that educators consult first and foremost with the administrator and social worker in their school prior to having these conversations in class. And that this is always an effective strategy. So to consult with our administrator or our social workers first, this is always an effective strategy, as they may have certain pieces of information or about a student's lived experiences that we might not be aware of. And sort of this can help us make sure that we don't cause more harm to students when we have these sometimes tough conversations in classes. It's also, I think, important whenever having these conversations that teachers are very aware of the signs that a student might be having a difficult time with one of these conversations. And so the Thames Valley District School Board, we use a process called the 4A response, which is a strategy specifically designed to help navigate student disclosures. And so the 4A response stands for Ask, Affirm, Assess, Act, and provides a process for Thames Valley staff to go through in ensuring that we help students if they are experiencing harm of any kind. And so ultimately teachers, I think I would like to remind teachers that there is a legal obligation that we need to contact CAS and speak to the administrator of our school if at any time we believe that a child might be experiencing harm or dealing with some of these tough issues that we might be talking about in class. And so in the same way that we need to always make sure that we're using a trauma-informed lens when we're talking about healthy relationships and dating issues with students, educators are reminded that we also need to seek to understand potential cultural differences when having these conversations in our classes. And so really, I think being mindful of our own identities or the identities that educators hold in having these conversations, and that this might be potentially a tough area for some students to navigate, depending on the cultural or religious or creed-based values that they come to our spaces with. And so cultural and religious and creed-based sensitivity should be embedded in all aspects of these conversations, and students may request an accommodation that consists of opting out of certain conversations as per the religious and creed-based accommodation guide that all school boards in the province of Ontario are mandated to have. And so this guide provides a step-by-step process for providing an accommodation to students based on their religious or creed-based values. So we will provide a link to this document in the comments section of the chat for everybody's reference. And any educator uncertain of how to go about providing an accommodation of this kind to a student is, again, always encouraged to speak to their administrator first. And in that same way, whenever we are respecting cultural, religious, or creed-based differences of students in our spaces, we also need to make sure that we are affirming the identities of LGBTQ+ students in these conversations as well. And so whenever we're talking about relationships, healthy relationships, dating issues, sexual violence, gender-based violence, that sort of thing, we need to make sure that these conversations include examples of same-sex relationships and various gender identities. So this ensures that conversations that we have don't come across as hetero or cis-normative. We need to make sure that all students see themselves or feel represented in the conversations in our classes. And I think this brings us to, I think, one of the main points that I wanted to chat about today, and that's the importance of modeling healthy relationships. And that comes from the point of view of having the privilege of being a caring adult in a child or a student's life. And so really thinking about not only what are we directly teaching in our lessons, but what behaviors are we encouraging based on how we conduct ourselves either in our classrooms or in our schools. And so that sort of old adage that regardless of whether or not students are listening to us, they are always watching us. And so in order to truly communicate how to engage in healthy relationships, I think educators must first be willing to model these behaviors to their students. So students learn a lot about mutually respectful relationships by watching how the adults in their lives conduct themselves. So, you know, do the teachers in their school or their classrooms speak about issues on consent? Do they engage in mutually respectful relationships themselves? Because I think this really does create the basis of a worldview for how students might engage in these behaviors later. We can never be certain the different experiences that students have had in their lives, and so school really should be a place where they can come, feel safe, feel included, but also see what healthy, respectful relationships look like in reality. And I think one of the greatest things that educators can do is to lead by example, by embedding healthy relationships in all aspects of sort of how they treat fellow colleagues or students in schools. And so similar, I think teachers, we also need to be willing to call out examples of sexism, misogyny, or abusive and controlling behaviors. And that this goes a long way in teaching students that these behaviors are not acceptable. As teachers, we know that we are role models for behaviors, whether we realize it or not. And so we must consciously decide what behaviors we want our students to learn from us, not just by us, but really watching our behaviors as well. And so as educators, I think one of the greatest points of privilege that we hold is we have the ability to decide and to control the culture or environment of our classrooms. So we get to decide, is my classroom safe? Is my classroom inclusive? Do students in my classroom see their identities and their experiences represented? And do students see examples of healthy, mutually respectful relationships modeled on a daily basis? So, you know, when a colleague pops into your room to deliver the attendance or to ask a question, students will be watching in that moment how an educator greets a fellow colleague. And this does sort of inform a basis for mutually respectful relationships that we want our students to engage in. And so I think that brings me to sort of the last subtopic of this chat that I want to have today, which are some of the different resources that educators can use in order to navigate these conversations on a daily basis. We don't have to do this alone. We are lucky to live in a community with other fantastic organizations that spend all day, every day on these topics. And so I think we can benefit by learning from their expertise. So I just want to share with you a couple of the great resources that I know are fantastic, that a lot of educators in Thames Valley are currently using, and that I think all educators could benefit from by using them in their spaces. And so I think whether we realize it or not, the students need this information, and so we need to pay close attention to some of the different resources that are out there. And so I think one of the first resources that I wanted to focus most on today is the 4th R's Healthy Relationships program that's currently housed here at the Center for School Mental Health at Western University. This is a program that Thames Valley has been using for so many years now, with such great results. What I love about this program and the resources is it provides sort of a process for having conversations related to healthy relationships, real world examples of what students are navigating, and it really outlines exactly how educators can and should have these conversations with students in schools. And so if any educator is interested in this, I encourage them to first speak to their administrator and then look at if it is an opportunity to first be trained in the resources, and then to start using the resources in their class. And then I also really enjoy or encourage educators to use a lot of the content on the website for the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. So CREVAC's website has a ton of great data, resources, videos, different links for other websites. It's a really great place for educators to start if they're looking for information on how to navigate these conversations in classes with their students. And then in the same way, this chat today is brought by the Neighbors, Friends, and Families Healthy Love Lunchtime series. And there's a number of other fantastic chats that are engaged in this series. So there's fantastic speakers like Jackson Katz, Karen Chan, so many others. They are great videos that you could show in your class, either in whole or parts of the video, really to act as sort of a conversation prompt. When having these real conversations with students, you can show a video, show a part of a video, and then do a quick activity based on sort of what was talked about in the video. So check out that resource as well. It's a great resource for educators looking to have this conversation in their classrooms. I also encourage educators to look at the Savvis of Halton website. So this is a sexual assault center website in the Halton region. The website contains tons of information and great resources, content that teachers can use in their classrooms, video links, links to other websites, lesson plans. There's a ton of content here. for educators to use if they're interested in looking at how to get started with having these conversations with their students. And then I think the last community organization or resource that I really want to spend a couple minutes chatting about today is White Ribbon. White Ribbon Canada is truly one of the leading organizations in Canada focusing on men's roles in ending gender-based violence, sexual violence. There's a lot of great content here for what educators can do, lesson plans, different activities to use in classes. But then White Ribbon also has a ton of fantastic guest speakers on a number of great topics. And I know White Ribbon would be sort of more than thrilled to come in and have these conversations in classes. So they're very much a resource that I would encourage educators to look at, again, if they want to have these conversations in their classes. And White Ribbon was also instrumental in helping to develop the Draw the Line campaign materials that I know all school boards in the province of Ontario received a couple years ago. These resources are a great first step in having these conversations with students, provide very real world applicable scenarios that I know students are navigating, and then provide sort of a safe, inclusive way to navigate having these conversations in classes. So again, another fantastic resource for educators to check out. And so that's the bulk of my presentation today. I am going to hang out online for a couple more minutes just to see if there's any questions that come in. If anybody wants a little more clarity or detail on any of the different topics that I touched on, I'm happy to hang out for a couple more minutes and see if any questions come in. So thank you again, and we'll be back in a couple minutes to answer any questions if there are any. So hi everybody, it doesn't look like any questions have come in, that's okay. I know this video will be archived, so hopefully so folks will want to check it out later and maybe use it in your classes. So again, I want to thank everybody here at the Center for Research and Education Against Violence Against Women and Children, and especially the Neighbors, Friends and Families Healthy Love Lunchtime Series for having me in to chat today. And I look forward to sort of connecting with all of you moving forward. So thanks again. Take care. Bye-bye.